Now we are happy to introduce you to the speaker of this breakfast talk, Charles Mok, who will join us online, obviously. Charles is business scholar of the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the Internet Society and a board member of the International Center for Threat Transparency and Monitoring. Charles served as an elected member of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong for 2 terms, from 2012 to 2020. Charles, we are happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Everyone hear me all right? Yep, okay. So, thank you so much, Anna and Yufan, for your introduction. Yeah, I'm thinking about this paper. Yeah, I hope some of you have read it. Sometimes I like a physical piece of paper better than just the PDF. But PDF is good too because you can always change and you can always update and correct and so on. But anyway, so I'm very happy to have the opportunity this past year to work with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, FNF, on this particular paper. And I'm thinking about it. It's more than a year ago. I think it was actually February of last year, and I wrote an article for FNF, and in particular, of course, with the Taipei Global Innovation Hub. And the article was about China's state planning on the digital economy. Now, as some of you know, China put out a lot of these papers, especially, around the 5-year plan period, every 5 year. And then they would have many of these papers on overlapping topics. And, like these since last year, they have been talking a lot about the Xi Jinping thoughts and so on. And about how they are going to, in that particular paper that I wrote was actually about the digital economy, a little bit higher level. But then we look at also some of these issues like digital infrastructure or software industry and so on. And we find a lot of parallels in the kind of grand strategy that China has been developing. And sometimes these papers are a little bit boring or repetitive, but sometimes if you look deeper, you can find the underlying trends and the themes are actually quite interesting sometimes and revealing about the strategy of China in a long term, if you look at it from a longer term perspective. So Anna asked me to actually last year to write a paper on China's internet governance strategy or regime. And Of course, internet governance may mean different things to different people, but when I was doing that, I found that actually I was looking at the development and the escalation, and over the years, the growing censorship system over a period of time, and over actually, in my case, looking at this whole development more than 40 years, almost 50 years time since the early 1980s. Now, of course, because that is, of course, a little bit influenced by my background of being actually, starting in the industry back in the mid 90s. Actually, I started working in the late 80s, but I actually started working in Hong Kong in the internet industry in the mid 90s. And I was seeing all this development all throughout the years. So to me, it has been a very fascinating topic, to look at how we got here, and how China developed gradually this grand strategy of internet control. They didn't do it with a grand strategy like a plan from 50 years ago. I want to do this, we want to do that. No, but it was pretty much based on a very consistent approach and overriding strategy of basically trying to control everything in terms of using different tools. Technology is one tool, but not just technologies. People think about the Great Firewall. They think about the technology that is being used in the Great Firewall, and the DNS blocking, or they think about the keyword filtering and so on, how they do it. But that's not the only thing. It's actually also based on a series of legal development laws that were put in place. And in the case of China, also very much overlapping laws. You will actually find that especially if we look at the original development back in the 80s and the 90s, there were multiple departments, although it was pretty much led by the Public Security Bureau, but different departments, different bureaus, and even different levels of government, from the central government to the provincial government, local levels, and so on, they overlap with each other. To me, over the years, I have always believed that this was a strategy to try to make sure that there was no fish that would go, penetrate the net, right? So they would catch everything. If one law doesn't catch you, then we have another law to catch to make sure that you will, what you do is not going to be escaping our attention and so on. So technology, law, and also operation. It's not just a matter of, okay, we have the technology to do filtering, we have the law to try to, prosecute or arrest people, or stop people, or just don't let them do certain things, right? It's not only that, it's also the operation, which include how to make sure that the companies that are providing the services are going to be the companies that will cooperate with the regime in different levels. And how to do that? Well, they found out that these foreign companies are not very easy to work with, and they sometimes actually also have to listen to different bosses. They don't just listen to the Chinese government when they are in China. They also, if it is American company, like those big companies like Google, Microsoft, and so on, they would have to also listen to their own governments. So that would be problematic. So from a very early time on, China make sure that companies that would dominate these services are not only Chinese companies, but also a small number of companies. They would not really allow or prefer to have a very open competition of 10, 20 different social media platforms or messaging platforms to compete with each other. They want them to consolidate. You think about Weibo, for example. Sina wasn't the only one to imitate Twitter to provide this kind of short uh, messaging platform service. Uh, there were actually more than 10 or 20 different variations of these companies in the 90s. But gradually, and I do believe with a lot of government direction or facilitation, the market was consolidated, and it was pretty much everybody else who tried to have a similar service. They decided to, or they were persuaded to get out of that particular field and allow one company like Sina Weibo to dominate. So to me, this is how I want to look at how China came up with this grand strategy of internet control. And to me, I lived through this period, watching all these changes and development from Hong Kong, where I started my own ISP, internet service provider, back in the mid 1990s. I always like to tell people the story that back in those days, there were actually more internet users in Hong Kong than the entire China. I'm sure that at that time there were more internet users in Taiwan than the whole of China. But of course, um, as we say, the rest is history. Now, China is already, of course, the country with the biggest internet population in the world. And from day one, again, I have to say that China really know what it was trying to do. And it definitely wants the benefit of the internet, whatever they are, the commercial benefit in terms of providing actually, back in the 90s, I do believe that China do want to provide more information, diversity, and sources to their citizens. So, but only in China's own way. So I can remember some of these, but then again, they also learned from mistakes. And for example, I still remember some of these early attempts that failed. For example, the Green Dam episode, where in today's language, they are essentially China was trying to put spyware into each and every computer PC that was sold in China. That was, of course, before the smartphone era, and that was 2009. So you can laugh at how, stupid this whole idea was, and they failed and so on. But actually, I think they learned their lesson. They learned their lesson, and they moved on to do things maybe in a smarter way. And when today we look at some of the debate particularly in the Western countries, about, for example, whether TikTok should be banned. It's very easy for Western or even Asian users, as well as policymakers, to think that, you know, uh, China's Great Firewall has kept all the major Western big tech or small tech companies out, and the social media and the media website and the messaging apps and so on, even the VPNs. And but it's easy to forget that actually before 2010, Google's search engine was actually enjoying a very good and healthy market share in China before they pulled out. But of course, if some of you are following the news in Hong Kong, you may also realize that recently there were speculations about whether or not Google will have to pull out of the Hong Kong market as well, because some dispute about the search result and the posting of a particular song that China believes, or Hong Kong government also believes, that it is promoting Hong Kong independence. So they have this idea that they would force Google with a court injunction to take to ban that particular song on YouTube, as well as on the hopefully also on the search engine result. So history is sort of repeating itself, in somewhat different circumstances and ways, but. But of course, I always also have to always remember to remind people that actually Google never really left China. Uh, Only the search engine business left China. Some of the other businesses are still there. There's still an office. There's still quite a number of people employed by Google in China, even today. So they didn't really pull out. So maybe they wouldn't be pulling out of Hong Kong either, but they just find another way to survive. Stop some of the services that are in dispute. So anyway, it's easy for us to forget that actually some of these platforms used to be present in China before they were forced out, like I mentioned before. Probably also because this is part of the whole internet governance regime to try to make sure that the dominant players in China are Chinese companies, that there will be uh, party representatives in the China in the company, probably even in the board. There would be even today, especially in the last since the last couple of years, there probably will be government investment in these companies taking a minority share, but with significant support or significant representation on the board of these companies, such as Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, and others. So it's easy to forget that it wasn't like that before. And so Google was there, Yahoo was there, before they got into trouble with the arrest of one of their users and put in jail for 10 years. So Yahoo found themselves in a lot of troubles with criticism from back in the US. And many other companies actually still at the time had joint venture with Chinese partners, including Microsoft for MSN services. Of course, MSN isn't even around anymore today. So China's grand strategy was to replace them with their own domestic platforms, and then they began to export them out. Most successful was actually not really the likes of, let's say, Tencent, WeChat, and so on, because those tend to be used only by the Chinese diaspora, the Chinese people that are overseas. or even I came to find out more and more people even in Taiwan as well. But I don't know how you look at that. But most successfully, I think obviously would be TikTok. So I didn't really, this isn't part of my paper, but I just want to make a comment that sometimes when I look at all these attempts in the Western governments that they want to ban TikTok in this way or others, and then they run into the conflict with some of their own values as to free expression and so on. It sounds like, are the Western government doing the same thing as other repressive regime in terms of censoring certain platforms such as TikTok and so on? Well, sometimes I think, why are they not looking at this simply as a trade issue? Because China kept out these Western platforms. And are we looking at a trade issue here that TikTok, as an example, may have to pay the price by being a Chinese company, and that it is simply an access to market issue rather than looking at issues around censorship, privacy, or misinformation. And sometimes I think we have taken the Chinese Great Firewall for granted. It's there, and people outside, for including in Asia, as well as in the West, they just feel like it's taken for granted, as if it should be there. And I think in that sense, the West or the rest of the world has accepted the Chinese internet grand strategy. And like Anna was saying in the beginning, they probably thought that it is just their own business. If I go to China and of course I follow their rules, and okay, I cannot research, cannot go to certain websites and so on. Maybe that's the way it is, but is that really the only issue that we are looking at? Um, the problem, I think, is more and more other countries, including Western countries, Western democracy, knowingly or unknowingly, I guess mostly unknowingly, they are also learning from China. So if you look at some of these democratic governments and some of the recent legislative effort, this is not part of the paper, but since I'm talking about it, I like to mention it as well. Such as the UK government's recent online safety bill, what did they do? The government wants to remove end-to-end encryption protection for the users on messaging platforms, because they think that in order to fight crime, especially about child sexual abuse materials, what they call CSAM, these kind of child pornography materials, they thought that by taking away the encryption on many of these platforms, such as WhatsApp or end-to-end encryption on Signal and so on. I'm not sure. Do Line, which is very, of course, popular in China, in Taiwan, do they provide end-to-end encryption? Do they? Anyone know? They do. I saw some nodding of the head. But anyway, so uh, in the case of the UK, they want the police or the government wants to take away this encryption so that they think it will be easier to fight crime. But you might notice that actually encryption is banned in China. Uh, if you're familiar with the some of these technologies such as SSL or HTTPS, uh, you don't find them in China. Well, unless you get a permit to use it, and otherwise you don't find it in China. Why? Because the government don't want encryption, because they want to be able to get at these information more easily than they have to face the obstacle of encryption. So essentially, the UK government and also another US bill that is going through Congress called the EARN IT bill. It's very similar. Western governments are trying to do some things that China has been doing for many years. And I just found out that also in France, they are trying to legislate and force ISP to perform DNS blocking on certain on government orders in certain cases, this another legislative consultation effort going on in France, which is basically using the same kind of technologies that China has been using to block website for the last 20, 30 years and adopting it in France. And of course, sorry, even for Germany, for many years, we have been talking about the Network Enforcement Act that has become the model for many countries with lesser democratic institution to try to censor information that the government or the rulers don't like, and to remove them using the basis of a particular law to ban. These days, very popular all around Asia to see these misinformation laws, and I think, well, I think we should totally blame it on the German example, but Germany was indeed the first, probably Western democracy to come up with a large-scale law like this that was, in my view, very much copied or imitated by Singapore as an example first, and then very much the rest of Asia. So what I want to point out is this rippling effect. China came up with the grand strategy of internet governance based on absolute control, and Western governments are also finding it difficult to deal with their own problems because of the, coming out of the internet misinformation and abuse and crime and so on. So what they do in response is beginning to be more and more resembling the same tactics that China has been using and other countries and other repressive regimes are using. In that end, they both separately, but really also side by side, are beginning to propagate a more restrictive future for the internet for all of us. So what we are seeing is that the internet is getting fragmented in all levels. Um, Anna mentioned the term internationalization. I might also try to explain that term a little bit. She mentions that when Putin and Xi Jinping met before the Beijing Olympic last year, Winter Olympic, in winter early last year, um, they were talking. They put out a joint statement to say that they want to see that the internet will become more internationalized. That is a code word. Internationalized is good, right? If you make it more international, it's a code word in two sense. The first sense is that what they mean is that the current internet is dominated by the United States because they think that the United States control the TCP/IP and the IP system, and particularly some of the internet governance organizations such as the ICANN that handles the domain name and numbering systems and so on. So they think that this is created from, well, obviously they are not completely wrong because the internet did came from a U.S. Department of Defense supported uh, 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 research network, research effort that started in the 50s and 60s. So the Chinese always believe that the internet is dominated by the U.S. So internationalize means uh, take it out of the US and the rest of the world, particularly China, Russia, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and so on, Saudi Arabia, and so on, can have a bigger say. So that's the first sense of the word internationalize. The second sense of the word internationalize is to take it away from the control of, take it away from the current multi-stakeholder model. Multi-stakeholder model pretty much means that, well, supposedly it's not controlled by the government. It is just like similar to some of these internet standard development development organizations such as IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, such as the ICANN, which runs again the domain name and the numbering system, the IP addresses, and so on. All those organizations, Internet Architecture Board, and so on, are actually run by many different stakeholders, but not governments. They are civil society groups, technical developers, academics, technical companies, commercial interest service providers, or non-commercial consumer organizations, and so on. They all have a say. But government can still come in, but they are not driving the whole process. What Russia and China wants to do is to converge the system into being controlled by United Nations. That is the other meaning of the code word internationalization. So if I talk about putting it under the United Nations umbrella of control, then I think you people, friends in Taiwan, would understand what the problem is when and if that happens. So that is the issue that we are looking at. We are not going to have this whole vision of one world, one internet anymore. The internet is going to be fragmented and in different levels in terms of laws, especially those that govern data flow. In the paper, I have certain chapters talking about, for example, the data security law and the cybersecurity law and so on that has been developing in China in the last several years. In terms of operation, Anna also mentioned about the shutdowns of different governments. Internet Society, that I'm a trustee of, in particular, has been doing a lot of work in trying to follow up on the economic cost to many of these countries that are routinely shutting down the internet for various reasons. It may not be as political as some people think about. In some countries, they even shut down the internet when there is a public exam because they think that the internet is too easy for students to cheat with the internet or maybe with their cell phones, with their mobile phones, and so on. So for a whole variety of reasons, countries, rulers seem to have a tendency to shut down the internet when and where they want. And in terms of course, also technical standards. For example, governance framework. Uh, China and Russia are trying to, in my paper, we also talk about how they are trying to wrestle away the multi-stakeholder standard developing process into a more United Nations and ITU, International Telecom Union driven model, with particularly some of the efforts that are undertaken by companies that are sort of representing China in these public global forums, which is Huawei, to try to push this agenda. So anyway, the and I've said a lot. I really want to leave more time to discussion and listening to some of your feedback and questions. And I have to say that the biggest problem I had with writing this paper is how difficult it has been to try to keep up with this live moving target of internet and technology policies. And the problem is I just don't know where to stop because somehow we have to stop and get it out to print, whether or not you're printing a physical copy or not. You have to go through the editorial process. So you will find that by the time you're reading it now, many of these content were frozen probably more than half a year ago, more than half a year ago. So some of the newest topic, the hottest topic, you will not find it there, unfortunately, like artificial intelligence and so on. So generative AI, ChatGPT, and so on, deepfake, and so on. These issues, even though even in China there has been new laws coming in these areas to try to regulate deep synthetic. They call it deep synthetic technologies, as well as just generative AI altogether. China is always very quick to come up with laws and regulations to try to regulate. But we didn't have a chance to include that in the paper. If you want to discuss that a little bit more, we can take some question as well. But again, as I said, just like writing the paper, we have to stop somewhere. And as my introduction this morning, I also have to stop somewhere. So I think it is a good time to stop and hear some of your feedback and question. Thank you.
Thank you for your very, very insightful and fruitful presentations. So, as Charles mentioned, now after his sharing, we'll move on to the most important and most interesting part of every event, which is the Q&A session. I will first ask Charles 2 questions from my side, and then we'll open the floor to our guests. As for the audience online, please leave your questions in the comments, or you can also raise your hand. I think we have the function in WebEx. Yeah, then we will gather them and pass the questions to Charles. So my first question is, as you mentioned, there are all kinds of techniques adopted by CCP to do in their suppression toolbox, be the technology or legal ways or operation, and a lot of them are actually exported to other countries. So I would like to know whether there's any tactics that got exported to other countries but notably failed. This is my first question. Maybe
You
if
mean
Mhm.
you mean some examples of how this kind of technologies or operational firewall has been exported to other countries?
Yeah, but then
Yes.
it
Okay.
maybe failed also. Yeah, this is my
Yeah.
first question.
Okay, you want me to take this question first? I'll take it very quickly. I think yes and no. Yes, in particularly in terms of technology. I think many of those technologies that are embedded in many of the leading technology providers in China are being exported. Obviously, both in terms of the the most obvious example is, of course, Huawei. And you will even see Huawei, for example, recently, let's take an example in Thailand. They are actually setting up a cyber security training center in Thailand. And what they want to do is, number one, to show that their system is very open, there's no backdoor, no problem, and so on. But in reality, they are also working with the government to try to make sure that they learn how to use these kind of tools that they have been using and perfecting in China for a long time, and build within the functionalities of these companies' products like Huawei and so on to make sure that telecom companies would buy these networks and so on. For example, when they sell these technologies like Huawei equipments to, let's say, Germany, I'm sure that I hope that the German telecom companies are not going to be using all these techniques. They might not even tell them about it, too much about it. But when they are selling these products to some of these global South nations, like in Africa or Middle East and so on, I'm sure that Huawei would tell them that, hey, you know what, you can do this to do this and do that. Number one. But I also have to say that the Great Firewall is not something that is easily exportable. Uh, because in order because I think China knows, Russia also know that China was successful in using this Great Firewall to get the absolute control, the level that they achieved, only because number one, they started very early, and that and it was a very consistent effort building up step by step. That was what my paper, going through the whole development, this 30 more than 40 years development, what I wanted to show. But for other countries, let's say if you are a small country, or it's not just small and big, but let's say if you are another country, such as some recent examples, like Cambodia, they were trying to adopt the Great Firewall, and China was helping them. But and they were trying to establish what they call a not firewall. They don't call it like that. What does they call? There's a name, but I forgot the name. But right now, but oh, Internet Gateway, National Internet Gateway, right? Uh, Cambodia was trying to set up a national internet gateway. It was supposed to go live last year, but they have run into a whole series of problems. Why? The biggest problem was many of these Southeast Asian countries, they're not like China. They in the past, even if they are like communist country or relatively more repressive regime, actually many of their telecom infrastructure are owned by foreign companies. China's infrastructure is completely owned by state-owned companies forever, since the beginning, even now. So it's easy to control. No other countries, very few, almost no other countries, not even Russia, can do that retroactively by going back and say, hey, can I acquire, can I buy back all these control and all these infrastructure? They cannot. They may not have the money, they may not have the technology, they may not have the people. Money means people. If they don't have the money, they cannot have as many 50 cents gang. Like in China, to undertake all these kind of whether it would be official or unofficial censorship. So it's difficult. So what you see is that China don't necessarily export these Great Firewall as it is. The technology, yes, but not the entire model. These days, even China, and also if I use the example of Hong Kong, they're not going to use the same firewall imposed into Hong Kong, but they will very targetedly, in a very targeted way, to try to remove information. This is actually more similar to how India is doing it than within inside of China or other countries. Like I'm even saying some of these Western countries are also doing. In the Western country situation, maybe they are not as much, but I'm worried, but they are not as much trying to stifle certain speech. But you are beginning to see that even in the United States with some of the southern states or the Republican states that they are banning information about reproductive freedom, for example. And they are using some very similar censorship techniques, but in a targeted way, not in a grand firewall. So I have to say yes and no, but China has been exporting many of these technologies, but in terms of the entire design, they have to be quite adaptive in different countries to try to achieve that particular goal. Even Russia, the difference is in Russia you have Google, you have Facebook, you have all those platforms there, maybe until very recently, but in China they already, they 10, 20 years ago almost, they are already gone. Sorry, very long answer to your question.
Okay, so actually, because of the time limit, I would just open the floor to our audience. If anyone has any questions. Or do we have questions from online audience? Well, if not, then I would just move on. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure.
I'm Bethany. I'm a journalist with Axios who covers China. And one thing that I find troubling is that there is basically no pressure or punishment on Chinese companies or entities for censoring. We don't put any pressure on them. There is only pressure coming from one direction on them, and that is the Chinese government. What do you think about the idea of putting companies, not all of them, because all of them censor now, but taking some top companies like Baidu and Tencent and putting them on the US Commerce Department's entities list for violating a well-established international human right, which is the freedom of speech?
Mm. Well, yes, actually, I think that is okay. Yes and no. Yes, and I'm not. Yeah, I should say yes, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether putting them on the entity list in terms of sanctions and what level and what kind of sanctions and so on may be the best method or the best way to go. I'm not sure about that yet. But I totally agree that they completely escape attention, even for many of the well-documented problems that have arisen. For example, you take the example of TikTok. One thing I don't completely understand is, and I'm sure that there are legal reasons behind it, that is why, for example, that TikTok has basically admitted to, let's say, the Australian government, when the Australian government wrote to TikTok and asked, are data of my Australian people being transported to China? TikTok was actually very honest, and they said, yes, some people in China can look at those user information. Some, not many, they say some. But that is that already a violation of some of their laws? But I haven't seen the Australian government actually come out to do anything more than that yet. Other examples like electoral interference into the Canadian elections in the last, not just one, but actually, oh, sorry, it should be Australian. The Australian election in the last last two general elections. And that has to do with misinformation that are being spread on WeChat because they are used by the overseas Chinese diaspora and lots of misinformation and so on that are being spread in on those platforms and so on. To some extent, I believe that is also a problem in Canada, where they have concentrated local districts with a lot of Chinese population. And somehow nothing is being done about that. So I agree with you. Okay, I've taken too much time again. Sorry. Yes, I completely agree. And I don't know why the politicians, let's say in the United States or even other European companies, seem to have. Well, European companies, I can understand they want to, they want to give the American companies a hard time. But what I don't understand is why the American Congress seem to have more interest in hitting their own companies than some of these very problematic companies from China.
Any other questions from the on-site participants?
Thank you, Charles. This is Potion from National Democratic Institute. So I would just kind of want to expand it a bit out of the scope we've been talking about, because as per your experience in Hong Kong, and especially on the political participation parts, I'm wondering how do you regard, the whole trends that you've witnessed and also documented in this report, and how it would kind of expand to Hong Kong after the NSO? Because I think a lot of times we talked about how Hong Kong might be, like more as per the freedom of expression, might be more getting into the situation of China. But as you know, in a lot of times we see in the NSO courts, there's still a certain level of roadblocks, and also like a lot of things are still followed by the regulation. How do you see it unroll in maybe the near future of a couple of years?
Okay, obviously the paper itself just didn't talk about Hong Kong, but I obviously this question is very relevant. I think in one way, censorship is not technology or censorship alone. You have to also think about the entire political and democratic or undemocratic, how democratic or undemocratic that particular country or institution is. So in the case of Hong Kong, I think censorship didn't happen because the Great Firewall was imposed. It was because the political system was radically reversed in a very quick, short period of time, with starting with the national security law, but not just the national security law. Even this week, there was another person that was arrested in Hong Kong because he posted some sort of, I don't know what, because they haven't shown the evidence yet, but, was allegedly posting seditious with its content that might have to do with national security. But they did not even have to invoke the national security law. It was using some of the very old laws against sedition in Hong Kong that were probably around, that are definitely around during the colonial period, maybe seldom used at the time, but they were, probably every country has some of these laws around. So it really has to do with not just the censorship itself, but how the institution, the political system are beginning to be so oppressive that they use these laws in a very targeted way, target certain speech. And that's what's happening. Hong Kong is a very funny situation. I shouldn't say funny, very, very curious situation, in that China, not just Hong Kong, China probably wants Hong Kong to be different from China still. They certainly want to kill off all those, uh, information or political dissent thoughts. They want those all wiped out. Yes, but they still want a relatively free regime. That, for example, like the recent Google problem with the national anthem or Hong Kong anthem and so on, I still don't think China or Hong Kong want Google to leave because they still want Hong Kong to be, uh, the foreign companies. They want them to be there still. But on the other hand, national security is taking a priority. So I think you're seeing this struggling, this sort of struggle to continue. But definitely, for civil society, for people who wants to be able to express themselves freely and so on, yeah, the government has been using, and I probably don't have time to go through all the different laws one after another that they are setting up, and they will be continuing to set up. They will be setting up next year, I'm sure, or very soon, misinformation law that will be probably based upon the system or the kind of thing that Singapore has. And Singapore's law is actually quite very oppressive also. And it's good enough for Hong Kong to just follow that, not using the China way, and so on. So they are going to do that, and they can just simply follow Singapore, if not India and other countries. They don't even have to follow China.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for all the questions, and thank you, Charles, for your answer. Now, due to the time limit, we have to end the breakfast talk here. So for the
Or
audience,
otherwise, it will become lunch.
yes. For the audience who joined us online, thank you for joining us. I hope you find the breakfast talk insightful and fruitful as I do. And I would like to ask our staff to stop the live streaming. And for the audience online, don't forget to scan the QR code there or at the reception. Then you can read the publication that Charles wrote together with British Nauman Foundation. And thank you, Charles, and have a good evening, I think.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.